What about some of the other technologies within nuclear, though, like small modular reactors, SMRs? Do those, like, I know that they don't answer to your criteria right now, but do you think that they make the potential to get up there?
I think there's huge potential in small modular reactors. I think there's a big barrier right now, at least in the United States and in some other countries around the regulatory climate. A good case study on this is just the recent events with Oklo, which is a technology company that's developing small modular reactors, really kind of micro reactors. They're developing for a very specific use case. Their first product is a 1.5 megawatt system, but they're talking about like between 1 and let's say 10 to 15 megawatts is the niche that they're going to start with. And I think they were very insightful because they really tried to think
I'm
of,
sorry to interrupt
yeah,
here. I
sure.
had to do that. What can you, just to make sure that everybody's on with this, what could you power with this type of reactor? Is it a small village, a small city, a small building? What are we talking about?
Yeah, these are to go, let's say, a small microgrid for, let's say, a subdivision or a small community. These could be for an institution like a hospital or a military base. Depending on how many of you might have to gang them together, depending on like a military base, how much power, really. It all depends on how much power, but that kind of gives you a general idea. But these are very small, kind of generation device
Mm.
technologies, right? For their targeting. Now, that's the thing. Like when you look at even the category of small modular reactors, you have different companies targeting different niches. So NuScale is another one, for example. They're targeting a considerably larger modular reactor. I believe somewhere in the 70, 80
Mm.
megawatt range. So you can see that's a totally different product targeting a very different application, right? So these are not, even though they're both small modular reactors, they're really different products targeting different niches within the customer base.
Mm. Yeah. What is your, but that's, they're working on them right now. Unfortunately, we don't have them working as of yet. What is your sort of your timeline on SMRs? Like, when do they become something that could be supporting the grid or even delivering energy to one of the places that you mentioned at the beginning that live in energy poverty today?
I think the biggest barrier to the deployment of these small modular reactors is regulatory. And we saw this with Oklo. So they went through a multi-year process to submit an application and to get a license for their technology from the Nuclear Regulatory Commission here in the United States. And they worked closely with the regulators, but unfortunately, their application was denied without prejudice, which basically means that they can resubmit and they will resubmit. But they kind of have to go back and go through this process again and build on what they've done. It's not like they're starting from scratch, obviously, but they have to fill in the gaps and holes that the regulator was working for. But this process is incredibly expensive. It costs tens of millions of dollars just to go through and get permitted in license for this thing. So they're charging the time for the engineering review, like at the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, they're charging like $300 an hour. So imagine every single system, every single element of this application is being reviewed by someone that's they're charging out at like $300 an hour. So you can see why it costs so much to get these things permitted, which is crazy to me. Like we should be doing everything in our power to support the evolution and development of this technology, not hamstringing it. I mean, we want it to be safe, and we want it regulation on degree of regulation is necessary. Obviously, we want to make sure these systems are have all of the safety and precautionary measures baked into them. But we can't. We basically almost criminalized this process. We made it so onerous, so difficult, so challenging that takes multiple years. If anything, like the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, unfortunately, even since its existence, hasn't actually approved a new license since like the mid 1970s. I think about 1975, when it was under their purview. So we're talking about an agency that hasn't actually, in almost the time I've been alive, hasn't hasn't actually approved a license that has gone into the real world and worked. So that's a problem. And so when you ask me about timeline, um, it's hard to say. I can give an optimistic answer, but the brutal truth of this is that at least in more of the developed countries where there's very strict regulatory compliance, like the United States, it's really hard to put a number on it. I mean, I would hope in the next couple of years their permit and license would be approved, and then they can start deploying. And again, it's going to be very slow because they're going to get one out there, and then a couple more. So
Mm.
within the remainder of the decade, maybe they can get a handful of them out there working. But we're not talking about scaling it to hundreds. Let's say by the end of the decade, it's going to be a very slow process. My view on this: nuclear power is inevitable. It is going to happen. We are going to continue to march up the ladder of power density to higher grade power, but it's going to take time. It's a nascent early technology, even though it was developed really in the 1950s. It's still new when we zoom out and we look at kind of the evolutionary scale of energy systems, which take usually hundreds of years to evolve and change, not a decade.
What do you think is holding it back? Do you think I spend a lot of, maybe I spend too much time on the internet where conspiracy theories are king, right? And they would talk about, oh, big oil runs the government or whatever, and they don't want this to succeed or something like that. Do you think that's holding it back? Or do you think that it's public sentiment and sort of votes that's holding it back? Because if you green light that type of project, you might be losing voters because it's anything that has nuclear to it is radioactive, pun intended. So what do you think is really holding it back on the government level?
I mean, in different points in past history, certainly there was various competitive technologies that were probably lobbying against it. I'm sure that's happened to a larger degree. But however, I don't really think that that's the challenge today in today's political climate. I just think there's so much misinformation and so much fear. It's really, I kind of think about this like it's almost like the four horsemen of the energy apocalypse. I think of what are the core elements that are holding these technologies and these policies back. The first one is fear. People have this kind of almost unnatural fear of nuclear power. We didn't always used to. This has been basically pumped into the narrative, into the culture in certain countries. And it's the same reason people are more scared to fly than drive. Even though statistics don't bear that out. We know statistically right. It's much safer to fly in an airplane than to drive in a car. I know here in the US, it's like 40,000 people die every year in auto accidents of some type or another. So statistically, it's much safer. But yet certain people, there's a large segment of people that are more scared to fly than to drive. Same thing with nuclear power. We know that nuclear power is the safest technology to generate electricity. And if we look at the actual level of death or health impacts in cancer cases out of this, and zoom out and look at the big scale, coal kills millions of people every year. And in the whole history of nuclear power, we've had 3 unfortunate, horrific accidents. And I'm not trying to minimize the accidents. Any type of industrial accident is a terrible tragedy. But when you look at zoom out at the big picture, in 3 Mile Island, no one died or had any acute radiation exposure in that accident. In Fukushima, in Japan, only one person died of radiation exposure. Obviously, there was a tragic kind of typhoon and the evacuation of the whole area due to the accident. People died, but it wasn't due to radiation exposure. And then even the worst of all accidents, Chernobyl, which was a tragic accident, could not have happened today, by the way, because of the way the system is built. They didn't even have a containment dome, et cetera. But in that case, even in that worst case scenario, about 200 people have died in total due to radiation exposure. You had the initial firefighters and responders. That was, I think it was about 28 people. And then you had about 15 people that have died due to thyroid cancers in 25 years since the accident. And then they estimate that 16,000 people got additional radiation exposure due to that accident. but but it's thyroid cancer, and about 1% of them are likely to die. So that's basically the numbers are, it's terrible. Like you never want anyone to have this experience, but 200 people and 60 years of commercial operation, we have industrial accidents all the time at chemical facilities and various types of pipelines and stuff that unfortunately kill people. But we don't shut down the entire oil industry, or we don't shut down the entire chemical industry because of industrial accident. So there's basically a misallocation of risk when looking at this issue. And when you look at all the benefits that the technology delivers, the benefits far outweigh the risks and the costs of it.
Absolutely. And you think I watched that documentary on Netflix about TMI, the 3 Mile Island disaster, whatever. I almost died just watching the documentary. I don't know if you've watched it, but there was a lot of I'm happy that some big YouTubers are making sort of awareness campaigns on that. A Decoupled Media made a very good one as well. But you want to know also what it is. Like I'm originally from Bulgaria, so I was born in Eastern Europe, Bulgarian. That's where my brother was born too. I was born in 95. He was born in 85. 85, pretty close to the Chernobyl accident. There's a myth that my mom used to tell me as a kid. My brother got bald. I'm actually not really bald. I have an okay hairline. Just zip it off. But my brother started getting bald at a very early age. Maybe so he's 10 years older than me. He was definitely bald when I was 15. So he's been 25. He started getting bald in his 20s. My mom used to tell me that that's because of Chernobyl. Like she got that from somewhere. She's not a nuclear scientist or whatever. It's complete nonsense. You talk about where Chernobyl is, you talk about where Bulgaria is. It's not extremely far, but it's not super close either. Not much could have, how do you even relate that? How do you make sense of that? And so, but that's just a general thing that they got by, at the time, communist Bulgaria, just hearing whatever was said on the radio and stuff like that. And then coming out of communism, the propaganda was possibly even worse. And that sort of destroyed the whole belief. If it even gets to a very, very normal family that I had, like nobody's a scientist or whatever within my family, but even they hear about these things. So do you think that because of this sort of image around nuclear, do you think, and how long it takes to develop new nuclear technology like SMRs, do you think that it's too early to think about investments within those fields?
No, I think we have to.
Personal investments, not like on the government level, of course, and unlike on bigger level, but just retail investing in it, basically.
I think it really depends on the timeline and expectations of the investment. And so, for example, in traditional venture capital investment, they're looking at a timeline of 10 years, generally 8 to 10 years, to get the return of the fund. Some of these might be beyond that. So it depends on the time horizon of the investor. I am incredibly bullish on nuclear technology and in that area because, like I said, I believe it is the future. It is inevitable, but the timeframes might be a little bit longer than investors are typically used to seeing, especially over the last decade or two when we're kind of used to software returns and kind of the rapidity and kind of rapid pace of their development. It's obviously going to be
10 months.
Yeah, it's going to be a different scale instead of a few years of turning around kind of a potential exit. It's, it could be more on order of kind of 15 years or 12 to 15 or something like that. So I think it really just comes down to long-term thinking. And this is just a mental model that not only individual investors, but I think as a society, we need to really start really being aware of and cognizant of, is that if we're going to always be stuck in this short-term mindset, it's not going to be good for us both financially or as a society. We have to go beyond that.
But so you're saying if anybody's trying to put money into SMRs, just forget it for the next decade. Put that money, if something happens, but maybe forget it for the next 10 years or so.
If the past is illustrative of what's going to happen in the future, I would say yes. Because like the example I gave earlier about the regulatory requirements and Oklo and kind of they spent a few years developing that application, and it was denied, and now it's going to take longer. It just, these things take time, and we're talking about approval processes that happen on a time frame of years, not months,
Mhm.
right? So just that fact, unless you're talking about maybe a company is trying to deploy and has a strategy about deploying in specific countries that don't have the regulatory requirements, and they have a completely different strategy. I'm not saying they can't deliver sooner, but I would say based upon kind of past data and history, it looks like we are looking at longer time frames.
You say that it like let me ask you this. Is this our SMR is an if or a when question? Like, could it take 10 years or is it going to take 10 years? Meaning, after this, like, is this eventually going to be a thing? Are we going to eventually start seeing SMRs as this sort of, mainstream thing, or is still very much an if question?
You know, the energy market is massive, right? It's over a $2 trillion market, and you're going to have many different products fulfilling different niches in this market. And so I am in when I look at nuclear technologies, I know there's folks in one camp of like we should just do large centralized systems, and then there's another camp that says, oh, we should just do small modular reactors because those take too long. And there's definitely a tension between those two. In this case, I think both are going to be necessary, and they're fulfilling different niches within this incredibly large market, right? So, SMRs, I don't think are competing with large light water reactors that are a gigawatt, right? They're a completely different product that's targeting a different niche in the market. So I actually think we need both. And I think the conversation should be less about how they compete and more about how they enable each other. The more we can get the regulators comfortable and get the public comfortable with nuclear in general, the faster we're going to see innovation across the spectrum.
Mm. So I can tell you where that comes from on sort of in my investor brain. I almost over half of my portfolio is currently invested in the speculation plays that have something to do with uranium. And a CEO of a uranium company told me that uranium miners or developers or whatever they might be, they're not in the mining business as much as they are in the energy business. Those are energy companies. Those are nuclear energy companies, essentially. And so I am sort of thinking like these new type of reactors, and we're only specifically talking SMRs here, but we can be talking about thorium or spent nuclear fuel reactors or whatever else that might be that could potentially, in my primal brain, take away demand from the uranium market. But it seems to me like you don't think that that's really going to be the case.
I think that that's pretty far off in the future where that would really be impacting the fuel supply and kind of the requirements for uranium mining. I think especially as you start talking about kind of fast reactors and thorium and those types of technologies, we're even talking longer time frames because those are new designs that need to go through this process. And the reality is that the regulators are used to light water reactors. So anything that looks like that is going to have a much easier time going through a regulator. If
Right.
you're going to come up with a totally new fuel type or a totally new process in the technology, it's going to take a lot longer. So I think from an investment horizon of in the short term, I don't think that that's going to play a significant role.
Are you talking about the regulators in the US specifically, though? Because I know that India has had some, I haven't looked too much into it, so I probably shouldn't say this, but India has had some news around thorium reactors. Let's generalize it that way. So they are one of the countries that they're not extremely energy poor, but they have, spots within the country that are energy poor, basically. Do you think that those countries like Africa, for example, is also expected to have the most population growth and just more infrastructure growth and stuff like that? Do you think that they are going to be quicker to regulate thorium reactors or spent nuclear fuel reactors?
It's hard for me to imagine. I mean, and I would love it. There's nothing that would make me happier to see nuclear adopted across the developing world in throughout Africa and India, etc. I guess I see that my belief is that the developing world is going to go through a similar evolution an embracing of technology that the developed world did. And the developed world wasn't able just to jump from, like in parts of Africa, as I mentioned, they don't have any power, or they have very intermittent restricted power. It's hard for me to imagine they're going from that to nuclear power. I think they're going to go through the same evolutionary um, process that we did, where they go from coal and oil and natural gas, et cetera. Now, every country is going to be slightly different depending on what kind of gift of natural resources they have, which are not equally distributed.
Mm.
But I don't think we're going to see this leapfrogging effect some people are bullish on. They're going to leapfrog fossil fuels and just go directly to nuclear. Not to say there can't be some outliers, but I don't think as a whole the developing world is going to just leapfrog. I think they're going to go through the same evolutionary process that the developed world did. And because they don't have the money for the upfront capital investment, that's really what it comes down to, is the reason why you're seeing nuclear deployed mostly in developed countries. Now, obviously there are some exceptions, is because it's expensive to build nuclear up front. There's a lot of capital investment. Now, it's cheap to operate, and the ongoing costs make sense because if you have a long enough time for horizon, the cost of electricity is on par with fossil fuels in many cases, but it does take a lot of capital up front. There's no
Mm.
getting around that, right? So someone's going to have to come up with that capital. And it's hard for me to imagine that investors are going to go into very politically unstable environment in parts of Africa, as an example, and put multiple billions of dollars of investment into new technology that hasn't necessarily, in the case of SMRs, et cetera, been tested across time. It just seems like too big of a bet. Not to say there won't be examples of it, but I don't think that's going to be the widespread adoption curve for the developing world. I think you're going to see these technologies first embraced in the developed world, and then the developing world will catch up eventually.
Mm. Yeah, well, this shows you sort of the depth of field that I have, because I'm exactly one of those people who would imagine that, developing countries, if they start developing or if they get to that point of development in the same time that SMRs are sort of getting to a more commercial level, they're, immediately going to adopt them. That's sort of how I always imagined it. But what you're saying here makes a lot of sense. And I would want to talk about the sort of the main problems, I guess, of nuclear in a second here. But it's interesting to me that you're mentioning alternative sources of energy here, because I believe you told me previously, or I read it on your website, that you were involved in hydrogen electric vehicles. I mean, in fuel cells, basically
Hmm.
hydrogen fuel cells.
Yes.
And there's a lot of talks in that here in Europe, especially. Korea is doing a big investment in hydrogen as well. But most of the energy experts that I sort of follow on the topic, they're not really bullish on it. They're not really confident in it. Do you think that there's like is there a future in hydrogen in like in the near or maybe medium to long term, like the 8 to 10 years? Is there any future there?
Yeah, I think it really does come down to the time frame question. I think hydrogen will play a meaningful role in the future, but currently it's not cost effective. And right now we don't have the infrastructure to even deploy it. So when we're talking about building various energy infrastructure, it's on usually in the order of decades, not a few years, because you can't just repurpose, for example, natural gas pipelines to use hydrogen, because there's very different characteristics and qualities of the gas. The gas it's much lighter, it's much more prone to leakage, et cetera. It needs different types of materials in certain cases. It depends on the application, but you don't just take an existing infrastructure that's designed around natural gas and think, oh, we'll just flip a switch and now we'll just pump hydrogen through it. It doesn't work like that.
Mm.
So there's a big infrastructure build out that's required, and just the unit economics don't work yet in most situations. And most hydrogen today is made from natural gas, right? Now, people are talking about using solar and wind to basically split water and to create hydrogen that way, but that's even I don't believe that is a viable, or it makes even sense from a physics perspective. Like the amount of solar and wind that you need to have to overbuild to basically, it's just such an inefficient process to come up with a molecule, right? So I don't, it depends on the type of hydrogen. There's all these colors now of, green hydrogen versus
Green,
gray
yeah.
hydrogen and
Yeah.
pink hydrogen, et cetera. So I think hydrogen will play a meaningful role in the longer term. I think it has some interesting applications, especially in the industrial side. I don't think that we're going to see hydrogen getting routed and pumped into people's homes and cars. I don't really see that on a large scale. But yeah, for certain industrial processes, absolutely, it could have a meaningful contribution. So it just depends. But again, the time frame, I don't see it happening in the next 5 to 10 years. It's still just getting going. It's like a baby, just in its very infancy.
That's a very important opinion to me in my investment portfolio, because I'm sort of trying to throw as many curveballs, quote unquote, that I could at you to sort of see the answer that you have. But it sounds to me like most of the new developments and technologies that people are working on, you still don't think that take away from the demand for uranium, meaning you don't think that those energy sources could take away from the nuclear thesis and the growth of nuclear that we have. Is that right?
When you say the other technology, you're talking about things like other fuels types, like thorium, or this other types of
Basically,
reactor
just
designs?
I'm just mentioning the things that I know about, although I don't know about too many. So maybe if you know about some other types of energies or technologies that could create energy that you think could potentially dethrone nuclear, you could tell me about them. But that's sort of what I'm asking.
Oh, I see. Okay, so I think that when I look out, zoom all the way out and look big picture, I kind of see the 2020s being the age of natural gas. Like I think natural gas is going to gain kind of the most traction because it's already widespread adopted. It has 50% of the CO2 as coal. It has 10% of the air pollutants. Most of the emission reductions, for example, in the United States, when we look at CO2 reduction, two-thirds of it, about over 60%, came from switching from coal to natural gas. So it's a cleaner burning fuel. Now that we're being able to ship it as liquefied natural gas around the world, right now exporting a lot to Europe, a lot to Asia. I see there's large investments going into LNG import facilities and export facilities. So I think the 2020s are all about LNG, natural gas, and moving from coal. Now, it doesn't seem that way right now because we're actually boosting coal production in this kind of unfortunate situation with this global energy crisis. But I think generally the trend is going to be moving from coal to natural gas, right? Because that's the quickest, cheapest, easiest way in the short term to yield the carbon reduction and air quality benefits. Now, I think the 2030s are really when nuclear is going to start shining, and hopefully we get beyond some of these bad public sentiment kind of fallacies and regulatory barriers in certain parts of the world. And we're going to start to see these technologies mature, so the newer ones, and evolve. And so I see, as I said, nuclear. I'm incredibly bullish on nuclear, but I think it's going to be a slower road. In the 2020s, I think natural gas is, where a lot of the opportunities are.
Okay, let me sort of try and word why I asked that question. I'm going to try and word it as best as I can, but what we have scheduled, what we have online in terms of nuclear right now, and what we have scheduled to come online or to keep running longer than normally expected, all that creates a certain demand for uranium from nuclear fuel, right? Which comes from uranium.
Mm-hmm.
And so I'm just trying to figure out how certain is that demand? Like, is there something that is going to come on just unexpectedly and take away from that demand because it takes away from the demand for nuclear energy? Does
I
that make
see.
sense?
Yeah, I don't think we're going to be surprised by some new technology that's going to come out of the woodworks that we had no idea existed. Now, that doesn't mean there won't be significant gains in kind of efficiency of existing technologies and new ways of deploying them. But the energy history and the energy technology is not like things come out of nowhere. They happen, over decades of R&D and iteration, and then eventually they start penetrating the marketplace. But they usually don't come out of nowhere. It's not like in software or other industries where all of a sudden social media just blasted on the scene and it didn't exist, and all of a sudden it
Right.
takes over the world. I don't think that we're going to see, likely. I mean, who knows? I mean, there's always some probability of kind of an outlier, but I don't see that happening in the energy industry.